Welcome back to Coffee with the Editor. We are still here in Cape Town at the Railway Safety Regulators Conference and Exhibition, and I'm joined for this edition of Coffee with the Editor with Andrea. It has been years. We've been moving in the same circles and we just haven't managed to connect for some time. Thank you so much for joining me here.
Thank you so much.
You were presenting this morning. What were you talking about?
I spoke about the fact that to find the infrastructure manager, to find the open access is not easy at all. It's a process, long process, as we saw in many countries all around the world, and it's a process that needs several steps. Rome was not built in a day, and the same, a railway reform couldn't make in one day, especially in terms of achieve the result. Of course, we have to go in the right direction to have open access, but of course it's very complex, from creating a track access charge system, capacity allocation, and so on. There's many steps that has to be done.
So let's talk about why it's so complicated here in South Africa. I mean, what has been best practice internationally in your opinion? I mean, because you've worked with this for a long time. Why is it so complicated and what's best practice?
It's very difficult to tell there's this best practice or other best practice, especially because every single country has completely different stakeholders, has different political elements, of course, that have an influence on railway sector. So this is elements. Of course, what we saw that we can have some good experience. This morning I present, for example, for the high-speed rail, the case of Italy, where we have right now two operators in competition on the same network. But we are speaking about a high-speed network that costs a lot of money. So this is an example. In the rail freight sector, we have several examples all around the world. I show, for example, that you have vertical integrating business. Think about the US for rail freight, or you think about JR for Japan Railways for the passenger side. And it's interesting to see different kind of business model. In South Africa, I think it's different, as in other countries different. It's difficult. So there's several elements that you have, of course, political pressure. Political side want to make a reform, they want to see the result. But of course then you have to put all the stakeholders together. You have to find what is the best way to reach the target of open access, how to attract the private, and take in consideration the South African rail freight especially. It's a very big sector, because if you compare with Europe or with Italy, for example, it's a huge sector. You have a lot of goods, a lot of coal, whatever, that are very, very important in terms of transportation. So it will be, I think, it's a long process. It's not easy, as in other countries, but I think it's possible step by step to reach the target, to attract more and more private investment in the sector.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but having recently been to Europe, the passenger, there seems to be more emphasis placed on the passenger sector versus the freight sector. And obviously in South Africa and probably the African continent, whilst we would like to see progress being made on the passenger side, our focus is very much freight, as in the pit to port strategy, which kind of hinders our process or progress in moving people. But how does that compare to the rest of the world? Because maybe Australia has a bigger freight body than Europe.
Yeah, that's really depending country by country. We know US is the country of the freight, especially we have some passenger service with Amtrak, but it's quite small service in comparison with freight. Freight is much more important in the US. Even if in the US, for example, I went very often to Las Vegas, because in Las Vegas, between Las Vegas and Southern California, Rancho Cucamonga, we will have the first high-speed.
Yes, correct, line. And that was signed recently.
Exactly.
Yes,
the 3 billion grant from the federal government to Nevada to give to Brighton and West. So that's moving also there. In Europe, in general, is more for passenger. Also because the rail freight needs long distances, long train, and in Europe is very complex to do that, because you have a lot of border. Every border, maybe you have to stop to change your driver, to change your loco, because the tension is different, because the signalization system is different. And normally we are going for a standard of 750 meters, the length of the train, that if you compare with South Africa or with the US, is a very short train. And you need the long train to make efficiency. So rail freight in Europe is very complex. to be profitable. Even if we are growing some country, the liberalization helps a lot. Then if you go to China, they put a lot of investment, for example, in the high-speed rail. They built 45,000 kilometers in the last 15, 16 years. More than double than the rest of the world altogether in terms of kilometers. So, it's a sort of continent, is 1.4 billion inhabitants, and the rail is very important. But also rail freight is important there. Then we saw, for example, when I go to Malaysia, Thailand, we start to see the first reform also to have a sort of open access or third-party access, whatever we call. And we are seeing that many countries are moving in this direction to make more clear the role of infrastructure manager, the role of a railway undertaking, even if are maybe the same company, even if are under the same holding, even if they are separated, but is going more and more to understand what is the business of IM, what is the business of RU that are different.
Yes.
So this is moving completely different from a country to another country, and I think it's interesting to see how it's moving in different parts of the world.
So in Africa, we obviously sitting with Transnet, who are going through the process. October is now a big milestone month. I haven't seen any headlines yet, but it's a milestone month for Transnet Freight Rail and their infrastructure manager and their train operating company, their division. But what is your experience in the rest of Africa? Like Tanzania, for example, has already got open access built into their rail regulations. Kenya is busy changing their railway bill. DRC has already allowed open access. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's several countries in Africa that are changing a little bit the business model. I think it's very interesting. For example, Tanzania decided to go in this direction, not only new infrastructure that are very important, also revamping the old infrastructure is very important too, but at the same time also revamping the legislation in terms to allow a third-party operator to enter and to use the network. So this is interesting because it's to try to use at the best the infrastructure that is cost money and to have much more possible train on the line, because even if the market share in many countries is 1, 2, 3%, that is too low. We need in Africa, as in other countries, more backbone of the rail, especially for rail freight. It's very important. Then also for the rail passenger, it's very important to have more passenger. But of course, in Africa, is more related to the rail freight, and we saw that this kind of reform is going on in different countries, and I think is quite interesting because it's a long process wherever country you go. It's complex process, but I think this is the right direction to increase the modal share of the rail freight. That finally is what interests.
So have you seen, in your experience, the actual success in terms of that modal shift? So with open access, having the private sector participation as we are envisioning it to be, to bring through that increase in freight, that increase in efficiencies, and of course safety. Have you seen that?
Yeah, for example, also in my presentation, I showed that in the high-speed rail in Italy, with the same infrastructure, we more than double the number of passenger kilometers. So same infrastructure, but we use much more. Right now, between Milan and Rome, there are 164 connections per day. Milan and Rome are 600 kilometers, and it's 3 hours by high-speed train. And right now we have 82 trains each direction between the two operators, Frecciarossa and Italo. That means that during the peak hours, when I go from Milan to Rome every week, it's like you have a train 6:30 in the morning, 6:35, 6:40, 6:45, 7 a.m. So you have a frequency of the train that really is like a subway system. And this have great impact because the price of the ticket went down because of the competition, the frequency increased, the quality in terms of the services is very high, and this give a result. You have a clear modal shift from aviation, for example, and from private car, to the rail. So, and it's also very important for environment because with more passenger, right now the majority of passenger is going by train, by high-speed train. Also, we decrease the impact on the environment thanks to the fact that the high-speed train is much lower emission per passenger kilometer than aviation under the car. So there's several benefits, environment, but also social, economic benefits. Competition could help a lot on this side.
So it's interesting that you bring in the aviation side, because of course South Africa is looking at a high-speed rail, hopefully in my lifetime, I keep saying that, to either Durban or Cape Town. And there really is a significant value to moving to high-speed rail, but it will have an impact on our aviation sector. Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I work a lot in the aviation sector too, so I know quite well the aviation sector. And in reality, what is interesting, that is a sort of going in the direction that is better for each sector. So, especially the short haul, normally it could be not so profitable for airlines. It's better to focus on the long haul, where the majority of the profit can come. So, if you have a train that substitute also the rail, could have a good idea to have an intermodality system where the train is a sort of feeder for the long haul, so they can work together. I work in a project in Italy, together with the airline, together with the airport of Rome, that is the biggest in Italy, is around, this year they will have 49 million passengers, the airport of Rome, and with the railway operator, they are working together to have a seamless experience. You take a high-speed train from Florence, you arrive to the station in the airport, high speed, that is also for high-speed train, and then you will take your intercontinental flight. So it's a sort of specification. It's not easy, but if you go, for example, in France or in Germany, that service in Paris-Charles de Gaulle or Frankfurt is working quite well. So it's an intermodality that is working well. So of course there's modal shift, but aviation could focus also in the long haul, where the majority of the profit for airlines is coming. So I think also for South African Airways, it's important to focus on the long haul, where there's no train or option and so on, because they can be more profitable on that side. So it's working together I think is the good solution.
The experience that South Africa is going through in terms of rail reform and open access, what are the lessons globally that we should be aware of as we start this journey?
First of all, I think it's very important to have a strong hearing of the voice of the sector, all the stakeholders. Of course, it's a political process, because it's a political willingness to go in some direction.
Yeah.
This is true for Europe, this is true for whatever, in Malaysia, whatever.
Yes.
But it's very important to understand what are telling. Of course, there's different interests. There will be who would like to block this kind of process, who is in favor of this process. Everyone have different interests. That is normal. It's try to understand what is better for the country. Of course, there will be an Italian solution, a Spanish solution, an American solution for South Africa. There will be a South African solution.
Absolutely.
But it's very important to speak continuously with the different operators to understand what is the best direction to achieve the result altogether.
So I think one of my little hesitancies here is that we haven't, from a stakeholder perspective, really engaged the full multimodal value chain. So in splitting up, well, it's not really splitting, but opening up the network, we haven't taken the time to bring in the trucking sector. And in my view, I think with open access and that last mile, first mile, the trucking industry actually could be busier than it's ever been before. But there seems to be the short-sightedness of actually we're going to lose jobs and we're going to lose this and that. Is there a best case that you can pick up from the trucking side, how that's really boosted the trucking environment?
I think that rail could be very efficient. It could be very efficient in some corridor. Think about the coal line and so on, that is typically perfect for the railway. Could be also good, really good for intermodal, for example, for container traffic and so on. But of course, when you go to the container traffic, you start to see that maybe you need the dry ports, and in the dry ports you need efficiency to work together with the truck sector. So it's also here, not only for the passenger, but especially for the freight, where intermodal is very critical. It's working all together, also this, because the rail can't arrive whenever you want. It's not efficient to have a small train going in the small profile. The train is working well with a mass, with the big numbers. But then you have to have a good system together with the truck to have intermodal ports, what we call dry ports or whatever, to work very efficiently together. And then, if you have a more efficient system, all the sector is gaining, all the economy is gaining, because if you are more efficient means that you are more competitive economy. And as in Italy, that economy is not growing since many years for several reasons, but it's very important also the competitivity of logistics sector to improve the efficiency of the country. So if you want to increase jobs in general, your GDP in general, this idea of logistics sector, that is rail, truck, ports, whatever, has to work all together. So all the stakeholders. Don't forget, the ports is critical, especially for rail freight traffic. Ports is very important. Also, the legislation is very important for the ports, the reform, whatever. It's important to work all together, because if we miss one single part, then you can lose the chain. It's a chain. So it's a chain. If it's a single chain is broken,
it all falls apart, actually. All right. Well, Andrea, thank you very much. It's lovely to see you, and hopefully not so long next time.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay. And thank you for joining me for this Coffee with the Editor.